the years, Gretchen and I spent an awful lot of time at track meets. 5 of our 6 children ran track for at least 1 year. Some in junior high, some in high school, some in both junior and senior high. And so I have a picture here of Carice taking a handoff from Maddie Boxa, running a relay at Marion High School. And I want to talk to you today about what is happening in that picture, passing the baton. For 1 year, Joshua threw shot. A couple of my kids were sprinters. One of my daughters was kind of a mid-distance 800-meter runner. And I always liked watching my kids run, but the relays always grabbed my attention because the passing of the baton is essential. A good handoff may not generate a victory, but will put you in position to win. But a bad handoff, you can pretty much guarantee you're going to lose. Notice the faces. They are focused. They are determined. They are going to have a clean exchange and set their team up for a win. Did we win this one, Carice? Probably got second. Oh, well, not bad. Not bad. But you know, a bad handoff has a different look. I want you to think about if Nick and I were to really mess this up. It's up here. I do pray that I do not leave you in the hands of a master of evil. And of course, Nick just said too late if you didn't hear him. And of course, if we carried on with the video clip, Darth will kill Obi-Wan, and some days I feel like Nick is in a hurry. Nick is in a hurry to put me out of my misery. So that's a bad handoff. Okay, if you're a Star Wars fan, if you've watched the movies over the years, that's a pretty bad handoff. I want us to talk today about how we do this in church life. I want us to think about 2 characters from the Old Testament. We're going to be in 2 Kings chapter 2, a little bit back into 1 Kings, a couple other pictures, but all centered around 2 characters, 2 prophets of God, Elijah and Elisha. And a very positive handoff between the 2. Now, I want to preface this by pointing out to you, I am not Elijah, and Nick is not Elisha. Although when I read this, I wonder. When he went up from there to Bethel, as he was going up by the way, young lads came out from the city and mocked him and said to him, "Go up, you bald head. Go up, you bald head." And when he looked behind him and saw them, he cursed them in the name of the Lord. That's our youth minister, don't you not think? And now he gets to be the preacher. I just had to do, I got 2 weeks left. I'm praying for a bear. If you don't know the story, 2 bears come out of the woods and devour these kids that mocked Elisha in that story. In a relay race, there's more than one runner. And I can't go all the way back in Eastview's history. There were ministers in this congregation before any of us were here. And I can't look forward into the future to the time when Jesus returns. But if we don't drop the baton, there will be ministers here long beyond our lifespans. Just in my little period of time, I can look back, and Dave Husky ran faithfully and handed the baton to me 16 years ago. I pray that I have run faithfully. And right now we are in a moment of transition as I hand the baton to Nick. And he will run faithfully. Well, in a relay there's 4 runners. So the reason I use Dave to build to Nick is there will come a day when Nick will hand the baton to the anchor runner. And that's okay. That's how a relay is run, folks. We tend to focus on our moment, but we have to see the bigger picture. It's just essential. When we look at Elijah, I love the character of Elijah. I've got a number of books on about him, and I go back and I read his story in 1 Kings. There's a lot in Elijah's life. Probably the most well-known story is his encounter with the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. It's found back in 1 Kings chapter 18. And just to recap that story, Israel, the northern kingdom, has fallen into just absolutely gross immorality and idolatry. And Elijah, as the prophet of God, goes onto Mount Carmel and calls up the prophets of Baal and Asherah. And he has a showdown with them. They each build an altar. They each place upon it an offering. Elijah stands back as the idolatrous prophets of Baal and Asherah dance and pray and sing, and as they get frustrated, they begin to cut themselves and let blood, and nothing happens. And Elijah taunts them. He says, be louder, maybe they can't hear you or he can't hear you. On and on. And finally, he says, okay, enough's enough. And he has the people dump buckets and buckets and buckets of water upon the altar that he had burnt or had built. And he simply prays. Fire descends from heaven, consumes the sacrifice, consumes the altar, even laps up the water that had been poured. Who is God was the point. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Baal and Asherah. No doubt was left in anyone's mind after that encounter. And Elijah felt pretty good. Surely this will bring revival. Surely this will turn the hearts of the people of Israel back to God. They will abandon their folly and they will worship God. And God will bless his people. It doesn't play out that way. Ahab is the king at the time, or Ahaz is the king at the time, and his wife is Jezebel, and she says, you know what you did to the prophets up there? Because after all this happens, the prophets of Baal and Asherah are executed. She says, this is going to happen to you, Elijah. This is going to happen to you. How dare you? You see, even when God is exalted in his church, there are people of the world who will push back and fight against the truth. Jezebel pushed back and fought against the truth. And Elijah, from the great triumph on Mount Carmel, descends into a dark moment. Chapter 19 of 1 Kings, beginning at verse 3. And Elijah was afraid, and he arose and ran for his life. And he came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and he left his servant there, but he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness. And he came and he sat down under a juniper tree, and he requested for himself that he might die. And he said, it is enough now, O Lord, take my life, for I am not better than my fathers. Now, I've never been quite to that point. But you know, sometimes life can just be hard, and sometimes ministry can be hard. And sometimes there are these great advances for the kingdom, and then the world pushes back, and you just kind of let out a deep sigh, and you say, enough's enough. Why keep going? And Elijah lay down and slept under a juniper tree, and behold, there was an angel touching him, and he said, arise, eat. And he looked, and behold, there at his head, a bread cake baked on hot stones, a jar of water. So he ate and drank, and he lay down again. I love God's prescription for the dumps. Eat something and take a nap. Now that may not be what everybody needs, but it is what Elijah needed. He needed to regain his faith. He needed to regain his focus. And so the angel of the Lord came again a second time and touched him and said, "Arise, eat, because the journey is too great for you." So he arose and he ate and he drank and went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God. And then he came there to a cave and lodged there. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And he said, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the sons of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, killed your prophets with the sword, and I alone am left, and they seek my life to take it away. Woe is me. Everybody hates me. Think I'll go eat worms. Poor Elijah, I'm left alone." And so he said, and this is God speaking, "Go forth and stand on the mountain before the Lord." And behold, the Lord was passing by, and a great and strong wind was rending the mountains and breaking in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of a gentle blowing. Some translations say still small voice. Some say a whisper. The Hebrew says a sound of silence. After all of the hubbub, after the wind, after the fire, after the earthquake, after all the noise, silence, quiet. Elijah heard it. And he wrapped his face in his mantle, and he went out, and he stood in the entrance of the cave. And behold, a voice came to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And then he said, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the sons of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, killed your prophets with the sword, and I alone am left, and they seek my life to take it away." Is he beginning to sound like a broken record? And here is the passing of Baton. Verse 15, God has to renew his faith, Elijah's faith. God has to renew Elijah's focus. God has to remind Elijah that as his prophet, he has a purpose to fulfill not yet completed. And the Lord said to him, "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. And when you have arrived, you shall anoint Hazael king over Aram. And Jehu the son of Nimshi you shall anoint king over Israel. And Elisha the son of Shaphat of Abel-Meholah you shall anoint as prophet in your place." He goes on, gets a little gruesome. But notice what he's told to do. He needs to go anoint others. 2 kings and a prophet. And the prophet will be Elisha. You know, it's not just preachers and youth ministers or elders and Sunday school teachers. It's followers of Jesus who experience moments of elation. Those times when we just go, wow, following Jesus is good. And we talk about count your many blessings, name them one by one. And we come up with a whole list of things which are rich in our lives, rich in the spiritual sense. But there are also those moments when we stumble and we fall. Maybe we are struck down with a painful awareness of our sinfulness. We feel like our prayers don't go beyond the ceiling. How are they reaching God? Because it seems like I'm just talking in my own head. There are moments when those maybe that we walked with on the path of discipleship turn away from the faith and go back into the world, and our hearts are rent with pain and a sense of loss. There are moments where maybe you want to sit down under a juniper tree and say, God, just let me die. Because they've torn down your altar and they've killed your prophets and I'm all alone. No, you're not all alone. If we were to go on in the story, God reminds Elijah, hey, I've still got 7,000 here in Israel. We may not think that's a great number, but hey, God's saying, Elijah, suck it up, buttercup. Quit being a whiner. Take a nap, eat something, and go anoint these two as kings and anoint Elijah as successor to you as prophet. There's work to be done. And Elijah does just that. And that brings us then to 2 Kings chapter 2. A wonderful story. You've heard it before, I am sure. It came about when the Lord was about to take up Elijah by a whirlwind to heaven, that Elijah went with Elisha from Gilgal. Elijah said to Elisha, stay here, please, for the Lord has sent me as far as Bethel. But Elisha said, as the Lord lives and as you yourself live, I will not leave you. So they went down to Bethel. Then the sons of the prophets who were at Bethel came out to Elisha and said to him, do you know that the Lord will take away your master from over you today? And he said, yes, I know. Be still. And Elijah said to him, Elisha, please stay here, for the Lord has sent me to Jericho. But he said, as the Lord lives and as you yourself live, I will not leave you. So they came to Jericho. And the sons of the prophets who were at Jericho approached Elisha and said to him, do you know that the Lord will take away your master from over you today? And he answered, yes, I know. Be still. And Elijah said to him, please stay here, for the Lord has sent me to the Jordan. And he said, as the Lord lives and as you yourself live, I will not leave you. So the two of them went on. Elisha is almost being a pest. Nick has that in common with him as well. He just won't leave him alone. Wherever he goes, he goes. I'm sorry, Nick, man, I got 2 weeks left, buddy. Now 50 men of the sons of the prophets went and stood opposite them at a distance, while the two of them stood by the Jordan. And Elijah took his mantle, folded it together, and struck the waters, and they were divided here and there, so that the two of them crossed over on dry ground. And when they had crossed over, Elijah said to Elisha, ask what I shall do for you before I am taken from you. And Elisha said, please let a double portion of your spirit be upon me. And he said, you have asked a hard thing. Nevertheless, if you see me when I am taken from you, it shall be so for you. But if not, it shall not be so. And as they were going along and talking, behold, there appeared a Ford F-150 of fire. Well, maybe not. A chariot of fire. And horses of fire, which separated the two of them. And Elijah went up by a whirlwind to heaven. And Elisha saw it, and he cried out, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. And he saw Elijah no more. He took hold of his own clothes, tore them in 2 pieces. He also took up the mantle of Elijah that fell from him, and returned and stood by the bank of the Jordan. He took the mantle of Elijah that fell from him and struck the waters, and he said, where is the Lord, the God of Elijah? And when he had also struck the waters, they were divided here and there, and Elisha crossed over. Such a familiar story, but what a beautiful story nonetheless. I don't know what lies ahead in Nick's ministry. Nick's not me, and I'm not Dave Husky. Dave Husky wasn't Dave O'Grady, and Dave Grady wasn't Fred Fish. That's okay. That's how God works. That's how a relay race is run. But Elisha went forth with a double portion of Elijah's spirit. It's interesting, if I went ahead, and I really don't want to read it all, but verses 15 through 18, Elisha comes back now amongst the sons of the prophets, and they convince him. They say, let us go look for Elijah. Maybe God took him up and dropped his body on the other side of the mountain. Let's go find him. And Elisha says, no. And they hound him, and they hound him, and they hound him, and Elisha finally says, fine, go. And they go and they scour the land, and guess what? They can't find Elijah because God has taken him to heaven. And they come back and they report that to Elijah. And Elisha, you'll find that Elisha's a little snarky. Nick's got that in common with him too. Wow, maybe you are Elisha. And he says, I told you not to go. I told you that. Now let me share with you what I think is a very important principle here. In verses 15 to 18, they go looking for Elijah. They don't find him. My point here is don't look back. Remember the past? Sure. I hope that you remember your time with me with fondness. I may not know. It would hurt my spirit to think that you would sit there and go, man, I am glad he finally left. That would hurt my soul. I hope that you remember me with fondness. I hope if you ever get over to the Peoria area, you stop and have a cup of coffee with me. But we have to avoid thinking if only we did things like we did when Bill was preacher, when Dave was preacher, when Fred was preacher. If only we could go back. No, please don't do that. For now is the time that God will work in and through our current leadership. Nick, our 4 elders, can you name them? 4. Rob, Kent, Kim, Dennis. Those are our elders. Let God work in and through them. The last time I drove through Illinois, I was sitting there thinking, I left Illinois in January of 1982. No, got married in 82. January of 1983. Moved to Indiana. From Indiana to New York, from New York to Wisconsin, from Wisconsin to Iowa. And now back to Illinois. It's been a long time since I've lived there. It's not the same state that it was that I left back in 1983. But last time I was driving through, I was looking at the fields laying fallow through the winter, and I began to think back to my youth. I began to think of the unending cornfields and the soybeans, and I found myself becoming nostalgic. I flipped through the radio stations and found the 70s on Saturday, and I listened to music that I'd listened to as a long-haired hippie freak high school kid. Yes, Lynn, I had long hair. Your dad didn't let you have long hair, did he? Or did you? No, you never had long hair. Yeah, I did. My dad was an old Navy man. He said, my boys are never going to have long hair. And my brother and I both had long hairs. My brother still does. But I began listening to the 70s on Saturday. I began thinking about my mom and dad. My mom died in 04, my dad in 02. But I sat there in the car and I thought, I wish I could talk with mom and dad. I got very nostalgic. I remembered old friends from high school. I began to long for simpler days. You know why they were simpler? Because I was a kid. The headaches belonged to my mom and dad. They paid the mortgage. They bought the food. They took us to the doctor when we were sick. I didn't have to worry about being an adult. And I realized, wait a minute, if you go back to the 60s, did you know that our nation was being torn in two? Do you remember that? Anyone remember the 60s? There were race riots in Detroit that left the city ablaze. Chicago was at war with itself. Soldiers would come back from Vietnam and would have bricks and rocks thrown at them as they were labeled baby killers. My own brother walked through the San Diego airport experiencing just that. You know, we look at today and we think, my, things stink in America. You know, when I move beyond just the nostalgia of a good song by the Eagles, I remember the 60s and 70s weren't that good either. Do you remember lines at the gas stations? Because there was a shortage of fuel? See, nostalgia only remembers the good stuff. There's plenty of bad in the last 16 years I hope you don't remember. Okay? But let's not look back and think if only. Let's look forward and think, what is God going to do? Elijah is taken up into heaven, and Elisha takes over. I want to read one more text for you. It's in 2 Kings chapter 6. This is another well-known story, and it's one of my favorites. I want to begin at verse 8. I'm going to emphasize 16 and 17. Now the king of Aram, now wait a minute. Remember, Elisha had just anointed a new king of Aram. All right, if you go back into 1 Kings 19, Elijah has anointed a new king of Aram. Now we're over in 2 Kings 6. Now the king of Aram was warring against Israel, and he counseled with his servants, saying, in such and such a place shall be my camp. And the man of God, that's Elisha, sent word to the king of Israel, saying, beware that you do not pass this place, for the Arameans are coming down there. And the king of Israel sent to that place about which the man of God had told him, and thus he warned him, so that he guarded himself there more than once or twice. Now the heart of the king of Aram was enraged over this thing, and he called his servants and said to them, will you tell me which of us is for the king of Israel? You see, he thought he had a spy in his midst. And one of his servants said, no, my lord. But Elisha, the prophet who is in Israel, tells the king of Israel the words that you speak in your bedroom. And so he said, go and see where he is, that I may send and take him. And it was told him, saying, behold, he is in Dothan. And he sent horses and chariots and a great army there. And they came by night and surrounded the city. And now when the attendant of the man of God had risen early and gone out, behold, an army with horses and chariots was circling the city. And his servant said to him, alas, my master, what shall we do? See, isn't that how most of us are? Elisha's kind of rolling over in bed. He stretches a little bit. He scratches his head and runs his fingers through his beard. Maybe he splashes some water in his face. He sent his servant Gehazi outside, and Gehazi steps outside and he sees this great army of Arameans, and he puts him into a panic. He is afraid. All he sees is what? The opposition. All he sees is certain defeat. And he comes back in, Elisha, what am I going to do? And Elisha says, suck it up, buttercup. Yeah, you didn't know that was in the Old Testament twice at least, did you? Verse 16, so Elisha answered, do not fear, for those who are with us are more than those who were with them. And Elisha prayed, and he said, O Lord, I pray, open his eyes that he may see. And the Lord opened the servant's eyes, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. And when they came down to him, Elisha prayed to the Lord, and he said, strike this people with blindness, I pray. And so he struck them with blindness according to the word of Elisha. And Elisha said to them, this is not the way, nor is this the city. Follow me. I'll bring you to the man whom you seek. He leads the entire Aramean army, now blind, to the capital city of Samaria and hands them over to the king of Israel. An entire army captured without a single shot fired, but with prayers offered. With prayers offered. And the king goes, what am I going to do with them? Should I kill them all? And Elisha says, no, that wouldn't be the right thing to do. You're forgetting the Geneva Convention. He says, I tell you what you need to do. Feed them, give them water, and send them home. And that's what he does. He throws a feast for a conquered army. Their sight is restored. He sends them home. Here's my point. Here's my point. Can we see with eyes of faith that which we cannot see with our physical eyes? If the church is to be the church, if we are to move forward in the work of God, we have to have sight. We have to have vision that goes beyond what we as human beings can comprehend. David, you talked about change during the offering time and the communion time. And sometimes it does cause us a certain amount of fear and anxiety because it might lead us into the unknown. I would say that in light of the transition of the passing of the baton between Elijah and Elisha, maybe having someone pray, open their eyes, Lord. Help them to see that there is more who are here with them than there are those arrayed against them. See, that's faith. And that's hope. And that's a future. And I encourage you and I challenge you to embrace that. There are more with us than against us. I'm not Elijah. I'm not Elisha. But I wish I could pray, Lord, open the eyes of those gathered here this morning that they might see. And that we would see this room and we would see our parking lot and we would see all around us the hosts of heaven, chariots of fire and horses, gathered together to do the will, to do the bidding of God, for the glory of his name and the salvation of the souls of men and women. I watched a lot of track meets over the years. Carice wasn't too awful bad at taking a hand off. Notice what she's not doing. She is not looking backwards. She's trusting Maddie to place the baton in her hand, and she's looking where she's going. I watched a number of track meets where even if it wasn't the Marion Indians, you felt bad for a team because they dropped the baton. Or they didn't get in step and they're out of step and they're trying to hand off and they lose yards, meters to other teams. And even if it wasn't our team, you just felt bad for them. You really did. You just, oh man, that hurts so bad. And there were those times when the handoff was so smooth, so slick, you just went, wow, they have practiced that. They are good. Folks, don't drop the baton. That's really my final challenge to you. Don't drop the baton. I'm going to ask Dave and his team to lead us in a song.